night sky over Crimea on October 5th was no longer a symbol of calm over the Black Sea. It became a mirror of collapse. Just after midnight, residents across the peninsula were jolted awake by the sharp whistling of drones, followed by thunderous explosions that rolled across Feodosia, Sevastopol, and Jankoy. By dawn, entire neighborhoods were lit by an orange glow. Social media feeds filled with images of burning fuel tanks and trembling hands filming from balconies. This was not just another Ukrainian strike. It marked a strategic rupture the moment when Crimea's illusion of safety under Russian occupation began to disintegrate. Ukraine's armed forces, in coordination with multiple intelligence partners, executed one of the largest synchronized aerial operations in the Black Sea theater to date. Western intelligence later confirmed that more than 250 unmanned aerial vehicles and cruise missiles were launched across multiple vectors, targeting energy nodes, command centers, and refineries. Feodosia, the peninsula's logistical heart, became ground zero. Flames engulfed its oil terminal, a facility designed to transfer fuel from railway tankers to naval vessels. When Kyiv's military spokesperson described it as a multi-stage severance operation, the message was clear: this was not a symbolic hit, but a calculated decapitation of the occupation's fuel network. By morning, thick columns of black smoke were visible from miles away, rising like a grim exclamation mark against the horizon. Russia's state media initially dismissed the incident as minor infrastructure damage, but flight tracking data told another story. 8 civilian airports in southern Russia suspended operations within hours, an implicit acknowledgement of chaos. The Crimean Occupation Administration's emergency broadcasts repeated the phrase "remain calm," yet panic spread faster than official reassurances. Cars began lining up at fuel stations. The peninsula's prized summer resorts, once filled with patriotic slogans, and tourists now displayed signs reading "No fuel" and "Evacuation route." Behind the flames lay the quiet precision of Ukraine's evolving strategy, a doctrine now termed by Western analysts as strategic strangulation. This doctrine, refined through 2 years of drone warfare, seeks not mass destruction, but the systemic paralysis of enemy logistics. It targets lifelines, fuel, electricity command, and morale, making the cost of occupation unbearable. In Crimea, it struck directly at the Kremlin's prestige project, a territory annexed in 2014, fortified with billions and symbolically presented as the return of historical lands. Yet beneath the rhetoric, the attack revealed an empire bleeding from its logistical arteries. As dawn settled, reports surfaced from Feodosia to Kerch of frantic phone calls and road congestion. Witnesses described families wrapping children in blankets, waiting in parked cars for hours. "We can't stay here this winter," one resident whispered on a Telegram voice channel before it went offline. Within hours, local authorities imposed restrictions on truck movements to prevent overloading the Kerch Bridge, but these measures only amplified public anxiety. The bridge, once the pride of Putin's infrastructure triumph, was now viewed as a fragile escape route, one drone strike away from collapse. From a social perspective, the panic unfolding in Crimea laid bare the widening inequality between Moscow's elite and the poorer ethnic minority regions, now paying the heaviest price for the war. Many of the Russian soldiers stationed on the peninsula came from regions like Buryatia and Dagestan communities, where mobilization rates were several times higher than in major cities. Their families watched the same fires on cracked smartphone screens hundreds of miles away, realizing that their sons were guarding someone else's historic land. This sense of exploitation, poor men dying to protect luxury dachas on the Crimean coast, deepened the fracture within Russia's war society. Meanwhile, politically, the attack triggered cracks in the Kremlin's narrative of invincibility. Local occupation officials, normally synchronized with Moscow's talking points, began issuing inconsistent statements. Telegram channels, even those under state influence, struggled to reconcile footage of burning oil depots with claims of total control. For the first time in months, the Russian propaganda machinery appeared reactive, not dominant. The Kremlin's carefully curated message that Crimea was untouchable was reduced to ash alongside the Feodosia terminal. In demographic terms, the psychological fallout was profound. Younger Crimean residents, many of whom had grown up after annexation, began openly discussing relocation to mainland Ukraine or abroad. Western analysts at the Royal United Services Institute (RUSI) observed that such mass disillusionment accelerates population flight, especially among skilled workers essential to maintaining energy and logistics networks. This brain leakage amplifies Ukraine's success far beyond the battlefield. Each family that leaves is one less cog in Russia's already strained demographic machine. As daylight broke fully over Crimea, the peninsula resembled a besieged fortress, cut off from its own supply lines. Fuel trucks stood idle. Repair crews waited for clearance that never came. The sound of distant sirens mingled with the roar of departing cars, an orchestra of retreat. What had begun as a military strike had evolved into a social and political tremor, reverberating all the way to Moscow. The night of October 5th was not just another drone attack. It was the first chapter of Crimea's reckoning. By the next morning, Crimea's calm facade had vanished. The fires in Feodosia continued to burn long after the explosions ceased, their smoke columns visible even from across the Kerch Strait. Roads leading out of the city were jammed with vehicles, families clutching documents, pets, and fuel cans. Local radio stations that once played patriotic anthems now looped emergency announcements about rationing and road closures. The peninsula's paradise image had flipped overnight into a symbol of chaos and scarcity. In the same hour, Moscow claimed all under control. The Crimean administration quietly ordered the suspension of non-essential industrial operations to conserve energy. The message was unmistakable. Crimea was running out of fuel power and patience. The destruction of the Feodosia terminal was not just a tactical loss, it dismantled the logistical core of the peninsula. For years, this port functioned as the main refueling node linking Russia's southern supply chain to the naval fleets stationed in Sevastopol. Satellite images verified by BBC monitoring showed the entire complex oil tanks, transfer pipelines, and rail connectors reduced to charred wreckage. Western analysts noted that replacing even one of those tanks could take months under sanctions. What Kyiv achieved in one night was the dismantling of an entire military artery that had kept the Russian war machine breathing in the south. On the ground, civilians felt the consequences first. Gas stations introduced a 5-liter limit per person, while grocery stores reported shortages as delivery trucks struggled to refuel. The once bustling Sevastopol-Simferopol route turned into a corridor of stranded vehicles. "We're not afraid of Ukraine. We're afraid of running out of fuel," said one local mechanic, in a video that quickly spread on Telegram before being deleted. In the absence of credible information, rumors replaced facts. Talk of another wave of strikes, whispers of evacuation orders for officials, and speculation that Russia's elite families were quietly flying out through private airfields. The social perspective illuminated a grim paradox. The poorer classes, many of whom had been lured to Crimea with subsidies and patriotic promises, were now trapped in the very region they were told would bring them prosperity. Buryat and Dagestani construction workers who had been sent to repair bombed depots now found themselves isolated without transport or wages. These were the same men whose home regions recorded the highest per capita death tolls in the war, while Moscow's youth largely escaped conscription. Their suffering underscored a brutal reality of the Kremlin's empire: the periphery bleeds, so the center may boast. This quiet rage simmering beneath the surface, visible in private chat groups and local forums, carried the seeds of eventual defiance. Meanwhile, the political dimension began to shift as panic eroded authority. Russian state channels insisted that the situation was localized, but field footage told another story: security forces struggling to control fuel queues and local administrators receiving death threats from residents demanding transport. Inside Telegram networks associated with the soldiers' mothers' movement posts lamented that their sons were being ordered to guard empty fuel depots instead of being rotated out. Women's voices, mothers, wives, sisters, started echoing across regional chat rooms, turning grief into subtle protest. Their tone wasn't political, but moral. How long will our sons die guarding burning oil? That question, impossible to censor, traveled faster than propaganda. The Kremlin understood the danger. It quietly ordered increased surveillance on civilian Telegram groups, while accelerating censorship across regional servers. Yet the cracks were spreading. Even some pro-war bloggers, once loyal to Moscow, began to admit logistical catastrophe in Crimea. The idea that Putin's military could guarantee security in the peninsula, once a cornerstone of his domestic legitimacy, was being publicly questioned for the first time since the invasion began. For the regime, this wasn't just about damaged infrastructure. It was about the crumbling of faith. From a demographic standpoint, the implications ran deeper than fuel shortages. Every evacuation wave drained the peninsula of its working-age population. Families that fled to Krasnodar or Rostov were unlikely to return, joining the broader trend of internal migration away from conflict zones. Russian economists warned that this evacuation drain compounds an already historic demographic crisis. Russia's fertility rate has fallen below 1.3, and its 20-35-year-old male population is shrinking rapidly due to mobilization and emigration. The Kremlin may win time through repression, but it cannot manufacture new generations. Crimea's emptying streets symbolized more than temporary fear. They reflected the vanishing future of Russia's manpower. Western observers noted another striking parallel. The situation echoed late Soviet Afghanistan, when control of supply lines collapsed before the troops did. Russia's occupation forces in Crimea were still entrenched, but their logistics now moved in reverse repair crews, waiting for fuel soldiers, rationing ammunition, and officers drafting contingency plans that smelled of retreat. Every kilometer of the peninsula now resembled a slow-motion exodus. By nightfall, Feodosia's fires finally dimmed, but the psychological blaze they started would burn far longer. Crimea had entered a new phase, not just militarily contested, but morally fractured. The war had come home to the occupiers, exposing who bore its true cost. By the second night, all routes toward the Kerch Strait were clogged with headlights stretching for miles. What was once a symbol of triumph, the massive Kerch Bridge linking Crimea to Russia's mainland, had turned into a bottleneck of despair. Dashcam footage circulating online showed families sleeping in their cars, their engines off to save the last drops of fuel. Soldiers and civilians now competed for the same escape corridor. The bridge, celebrated by Putin in 2018 as an eternal link to Russia, had become a visual metaphor for the empire's fragility. Each passing hour eroded not only logistical capacity, but also the myth of control. As the queue lengthened, Russia's Ministry of Transport hurriedly reactivated old ferry routes across the Kerch Strait. These lines had been mothballed since 2020 after the bridge rendered them redundant. Now, tugboats and ferries that once carried tourists were hastily re-equipped to shuttle vehicles, soldiers, and emergency supplies. But this improvised network was a shadow of its former self-rusted docks, aging vessels' limited capacity. Engineers worked under floodlights, welding decks and reinforcing ramps, while local administrators announced controlled ferry rotations. Yet the images that emerged told the opposite story. Ferries overloaded with cars, military trucks jammed at piers, and civilians waving passports, hoping to get aboard. Ukrainian defense analysts like Andrei Zablotsky described the chaos as a rehearsal for evacuation. Western intelligence shared that assessment. Satellite imagery reviewed by Reuters confirmed that dozens of military transport vehicles had queued near the bridge's entry zones, and Russian radio traffic revealed plans to move light weaponry and logistics units northward. It was not a mass retreat, at least not yet, but it was unmistakably a reconfiguration. In military terms, it meant the Kremlin no longer viewed Crimea as a secure, permanent stronghold. For residents, however, this was a social unraveling. The social perspective reveals how fear dissolved the lines between occupier and occupied. Ethnic Russian settlers, many of whom had moved to Crimea after 2014, now found themselves desperate to leave, while the peninsula's native Crimean Tatars watched the spectacle with bitter irony. For years, their voices were suppressed under Moscow's narrative of reunification. Now, those same settlers were learning what occupation felt like when the tables turned. "We built homes here believing in protection," said one evacuee on VKontakte before deleting his account. Now even the bridge feels like a trap. The political dimension was equally volatile. Moscow dispatched emergency envoys to manage the optics. Russian state television cut live coverage from Crimea, entirely replacing it with pre-recorded documentaries about the success of reconstruction. Kremlin spokesman framed the ferry activation as routine logistical adaptation. But on Telegram, the last space where uncensored voices could still flicker, panic was visible. Channels affiliated with Russian mill bloggers like Rybar began questioning why civilian cars were being held, while military convoys crossed first. Videos showed angry crowds shouting at soldiers near inspection points. For the first time since annexation, the Kremlin's hierarchy of control soldiers above civilians' propaganda above truth was being challenged openly on its own soil. Within those protests, women again became a moral force. The wives and mothers of soldiers stranded in Crimea posted videos demanding evacuation priorities for families and children. They were not activists, nor did they chant anti-war slogans, but their mere presence, pleading, crying, recording, posed a dilemma for the authorities. Arresting them would expose the regime's cruelty. Ignoring them would magnify its impotence. This quiet feminine resistance born out of desperation mirrored earlier movements in Buryatia and Dagestan, where women had used social media to confront conscription officers and regional governors. The same emotional current now flowed into Crimea's panic zones. Demographically, the exodus worsened Russia's long-term crisis. According to The Economist, the country has already lost over 1.3 million working-age men since 2022, either killed, wounded, or having fled abroad. Crimea's evacuation added another ripple. Skilled port workers, engineers, and technicians, many of whom had relocated from mainland Russia, were now abandoning their posts. Each departure weakened the industrial base Moscow had spent years cultivating. Economists at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow warned that if the outflow continues, the peninsula's recovery capacity could fall below 50% by next summer, a threshold where basic maintenance of roads, ports, and energy lines becomes impossible. On the ground, the human stories multiplied. A young woman from Sevastopol, speaking anonymously to Al Jazeera, described how her family waited 18 hours to cross the bridge before turning back. It felt like everyone was running, but no one knew from what she said. We realized it wasn't just fear of bombs, it was fear of being forgotten. That sense of abandonment, both by Moscow and by fate, spread like a contagion. Meanwhile, Ukrainian military planners understood the psychological magnitude of these scenes. Kyiv didn't need to bomb the bridge that week. The traffic jams did the work. Each car that fled symbolized another crack in the Kremlin's narrative of eternal control. Crimea, once presented as Russia's sacred victory, was morphing into its most visible defeat, a slow-motion collapse where logistics, legitimacy, and loyalty all burned together. In that sense, the Kerch Bridge now stood not as a triumph of engineering, but as a monument to overreach a structure built to bind an empire that was quietly unraveling beneath its own weight. To understand the scale of what happened over Crimea, one must examine the operation through the prism of design, not coincidence. The night of October 5th was not an isolated strike. It was the practical application of Ukraine's strategic strangulation doctrine, a methodical framework aimed at choking the Russian military's supply arteries without engaging in frontal assaults. This doctrine, shaped since mid-2023 with Western technological support and battlefield data, rests on one idea: control the tempo by collapsing logistics. What Ukraine launched that night was the culmination of 2 years of testing swarms, misdirection, and electronic warfare convergence. At its core, the doctrine transforms the battlefield into an ecosystem of disruption. Hundreds of drones, ranging from long-range jet-powered types to small expendable quadcopters, were programmed to strike in layered waves. The first wave targeted radar sites, forcing Russian air defenses to activate. The second wave, operating at low altitude, homed in on fuel depots and command relays illuminated by those same defensive emissions. When the Feodosia oil terminal exploded, it was not simply luck, it was data-driven precision. According to Defense News, NATO reconnaissance aircraft patrolling over the Black Sea provided electronic mapping of Russian radar responses, allowing Ukrainian operators to exploit timing gaps between the S-300 and S-400 systems. Russian defenses, once touted as impenetrable, were overwhelmed. The S-400 batteries, designed to counter aircraft and ballistic missiles, proved nearly blind to small, low-signature drones flying at 80 meters. The Pantsir S-1 systems, tasked with short-range defense, exhausted their ammunition within minutes of the first wave. Analysts at Military Watch magazine later confirmed that several air defense crews switched off radars entirely to avoid electronic counter-targeting, creating deadly blind spots. This technical breakdown exposed the gulf between Russia's ceremonial military image and its actual adaptability in real warfare. The political ramifications were equally severe. For years, Moscow had presented its weaponry, especially the S-400s, as symbols of national pride and export power. Their failure in Crimea was more than a tactical embarrassment. It undermined the Kremlin's prestige abroad. India and Turkey, two major purchasers of Russian systems, reportedly demanded reassurances on performance reliability. Within Russia, pro-war bloggers began using phrases like technical treason and command paralysis. The once untouchable Ministry of Defense became the new scapegoat, with voices inside the Duma questioning why Crimea's air defenses were spread thin to protect empty prestige targets instead of vital fuel infrastructure. Such debates would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The social layer of this doctrine's impact cannot be ignored. As explosions repeated across Crimea, the psychological pressure on civilians intensified. Each successive strike eroded faith in Moscow's promises of protection. In towns like Jankoy and Saki, residents spoke of sleepless nights and counting the drones instead of sheep. Telegram channels, once dedicated to patriotic slogans, were filled instead with requests for evacuation routes and generator sales. The occupation's facade of normality sponsored concerts, televised parades, slogans of "forever ours" collapsed into survivalism. The Kremlin's peace through control narrative met its quiet undoing through the hum of hundreds of small, defiant machines. From a demographic perspective, Ukraine's strategic targeting carried long-term implications far beyond military damage. Each destroyed fuel depot, transformer, or rail junction accelerates the migration of Crimea's technical class, the engineers, electricians, and logistics specialists who sustain modern infrastructure. According to BBC interviews with displaced residents, many of these workers have already moved to southern Russia or abroad, unwilling to risk being trapped again. This migration deepens Russia's demographic hemorrhage, a double loss of soldiers at the front and specialists in the rear. By 2025, demographers estimate that Russia's working-age population has contracted by nearly 2.5 million since the full-scale invasion, a blow no propaganda can repair. For Ukraine, this methodical dismantling has an additional psychological dimension. By targeting symbols of permanence, bridges, refineries, railway hubs, it communicates to Crimeans that Moscow cannot guarantee tomorrow. That uncertainty becomes as powerful a weapon as any missile. Western analysts call it cognitive attrition when the population rather than the army loses the will to sustain an occupation. It is warfare that operates not through shock, but through erosion, where each blackout, each shortage, and each siren wears down the fabric of compliance. Inside the Kremlin, this erosion sparked quiet panic. A confidential assessment leaked to independent Russian outlet Meduza warned that the information environment in Crimea has become unmanageable. Officials described local populations refusing to cooperate with reconstruction crews and hoarding fuel in defiance of rationing orders. In Moscow, emergency meetings debated whether to rotate elite airborne units from the Zaporizhzhia front to Crimea, an admission that the peninsula could no longer defend itself with static garrisons. Every such redeployment weakens Russia elsewhere, further straining its overstretched manpower. The political ripple of that night thus extends far beyond Feodosia. It questions Putin's entire narrative of restored greatness. Crimea was supposed to symbolize rebirth. Instead, it now embodies decline. The bridge that once unified has divided. The fortress that promised security now generates refugees, and the army that once intimidated Europe now struggles to refuel its trucks. Through calculated strangulation, Ukraine turned geography against the empire that conquered it, proof that in modern warfare, control no longer belongs to the side with more weapons, but to the side that controls time perception and energy. While Russian state media continued to describe the situation in Crimea as under-control, satellite data and intercepted communications painted a very different picture. The peninsula had become a pressure chamber, where every logistical failure exposed another layer of vulnerability. Ukraine's strikes had not only destroyed critical assets, they had revealed the weak veins beneath Russia's armor. Military analysts from Reuters and the Institute for the Study of War confirmed that Ukraine's next targets were already being mapped out: the Jankoy railway junction, the Belbek and Saki air bases, and the fragile substations along the Simferopol-Kerch corridor. In essence, Kyiv was tightening the noose one link at a time. The Jankoy hub, a sprawling network connecting Crimea to mainland supply routes, was particularly crucial. Russian forces depended on it for transferring fuel, ammunition, and equipment to units stationed along the southern front. But with rail lines damaged and transformers overloaded from the previous week's attacks, resupply slowed to a crawl. Each delay forced commanders to ration everything from artillery shells to heating fuel. The effect rippled outward. Troops grew restless. Local administrations panicked and morale plummeted. A senior Western defense source, quoted by The Guardian, compared the situation to a snake choking on its own tail. In Sevastopol, home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet, the once proud naval docks were now symbols of paralysis. Repeated Ukrainian drone strikes had forced ships into deeper harbors, where movement was limited and surveillance constant. Even the fleet's command nodes began decentralizing to smaller facilities around South Bay, a move that diluted coordination and inflated fuel consumption. Each relocation required more generators, more diesel, and more guards, multiplying vulnerability. This cascading strain was exactly what Ukraine's strategic strangulation doctrine intended: not one catastrophic blow, but 1,000 small incisions bleeding the system dry. From a political perspective, these failures began to reach the Kremlin's inner circle. Intelligence leaks published by Novaya Gazeta Europe indicated growing rifts between Russia's defense ministry and regional administrators in Crimea. Local officials demanded emergency funds to restore power grids and rebuild depots, while Moscow insisted that existing budgets suffice. This bureaucratic deadlock exposed the limits of Putin's vertical power structure, one that appeared omnipotent from afar but brittle in crisis. The longer the central command delayed aid, the louder the regional resentment grew. Even loyal administrators began to whisper about Moscow's abandonment. Meanwhile, social unrest simmered under the surface. The fuel rationing and collapsing supply chains revived old-class tensions between Russian settlers and native Crimean Tatars. The settlers, once favored by Moscow's subsidies, now accused local authorities of corruption and hoarding. Videos on Telegram showed small protests outside distribution centers, with people shouting, "Where is our Russia now?" Security forces swiftly dispersed them, but the message was clear: the illusion of order had shattered. Women, particularly those connected to soldiers stationed across the peninsula, continued to play a unique role in this disintegration. They used private telegram channels to coordinate mutual aid, distribute food, and share uncensored casualty lists. These networks of wives and mothers, though unarmed and apolitical, functioned as invisible opposition, moral voices impossible to suppress without backlash. From the demographic perspective, every blast and blackout accelerated an irreversible process. Families with means were leaving en masse, selling properties to whoever would buy. The poorest stayed behind, deepening the economic divide. Economists at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace estimated that by mid-2025, Crimea's population could decline by up to 12%, an unprecedented contraction for a region that had seen steady growth under Russian control. This demographic recoil has long-term implications: fewer workers, declining tax revenue, and the collapse of the very social infrastructure that sustains an occupation. Hospitals, schools, and utilities can't function without staff. And those who remain live with a growing sense that they are the disposable citizens of a faltering empire. Even Russian propaganda began showing signs of fatigue. Television hosts spoke of temporary setbacks with strained optimism, while patriotic influencers on social media switched to nostalgic themes about Crimea's glorious past. The Kremlin's control of narrative, a key weapon since 2014, was slipping under the weight of visible, unspinnable facts. The once untouchable notion that Crimea is forever Russian was being replaced by quieter questions. How long can it be held, and at what cost? Behind these questions lay a grim strategic reality. Ukraine didn't need to recapture every inch of the peninsula militarily. It only had to make holding it untenable. Each strike on a transformer or railway line deepened that calculus. As the Royal United Services Institute (RUSI) observed, Crimea's defeat may come not from invasion, but from exhaustion. This exhaustion was visible in every aspect of life, from the fuel queues stretching across the highways to the darkened windows of Sevastopol's once glittering harbor. Even Russia's attempts to adapt seemed to confirm its weakness. Engineers from Moscow rushed to rebuild energy substations, but many lacked the specialized components lost to sanctions. Temporary fixes failed repeatedly. Each blackout further alienated the population. Each delay revealed how unprepared the Kremlin was for a war of attrition on its own territory. Crimea's infrastructure, once a monument to Putin's power, now symbolized his vulnerability. In the end, The peninsula was no longer just a military base. It had become a metaphor for a system under siege by its own contradictions. What began as a war of conquest had turned into a war of endurance, and Russia was running out of both time and people to fight it. As autumn deepened over Crimea, the fires of Feodosia gave way to a more enduring kind of collapse, one not measured in explosions, but in silence. Gas stations emptied, schools shortened schedules due to blackouts, and the chatter in cafes shifted from pride to fear. The very symbols that once embodied Moscow's triumph, new roads, bridges, and ports, now stood as relics of a fading empire. The peninsula, long touted as the jewel of Russia, had become a trapped island severed from its mainland lifeline and its myth of invincibility. For the Kremlin, the unraveling of Crimea was more than a logistical crisis. It was an existential one. Putin's image, built on the promise of control and historical restoration, depended on Crimea's stability. Losing it, or even appearing to lose grip, meant conceding that the war had turned inward. Western intelligence reports, cited by Reuters, suggested that Moscow had quietly redeployed elements of its Black Sea fleet toward Novorossiysk, a move that confirmed the Kremlin's diminishing confidence in Sevastopol's security. Each withdrawal, however partial, carried enormous symbolic weight. It was the slow peeling away of the myth that Russia could hold what it had taken by force. The political fractures widened quickly. Inside Russia, dissent found new channels. Soldiers' wives and mothers from the regions hardest hit by mobilization, Dagestan, Buryatia, Tuva, began organizing online vigils for the missing sons of Crimea. Their message was not overtly political, but its moral charge was explosive. We are the ones paying for the empire's dream. By 2025, these women's groups had grown into a moral coalition that the Kremlin could neither silence nor fully acknowledge. As BBC reported, their demands for accountability were spreading across Telegram networks faster than official denials could erase them. Meanwhile, the social perspective exposed the widening gulf between Russia's privileged urban core and its impoverished periphery. While elites in Moscow continued to attend galas and boast of strategic patience, families from minority republics mourned quietly in crumbling apartments. In towns like Ulan-Ude and Makhachkala, posters promising bonuses for volunteer contracts returned, recruiting a new round of poor men to die for a war already lost in morale. The ethnic imbalance of sacrificed Buryats, Dagestanis, Yakuts was no longer a whispered reality, but an open wound. As one analyst from the Moscow Times noted, the empire's edges are bleeding faster than its heart can pump. That inequality, once hidden by patriotic slogans, was now visible in every funeral convoy and every empty village. From the demographic lens, the long-term picture is catastrophic. The Kremlin's mobilization policies and the continuing brain drain have carved deep scars into Russia's future. The Federal Statistics Service quietly admitted that the working-age male population had dropped by nearly 4 million since 2022. Economists warn that entire sectors from IT to heavy engineering are collapsing under the weight of labor shortages. Young professionals who fled conscription to countries like Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Germany have not returned, depriving the state of both talent and tax base. In Crimea itself, population loss is now accelerating as families relocate permanently to avoid another winter without stability. Each departure not only weakens the occupation, it erases the demographic illusion that Crimea could ever be fully Russian. As the peninsula's crisis deepens, Ukraine's strategy has shifted from strikes to shaping. By sustaining psychological pressure through precision raids and information warfare, Kiev has made Crimea a liability rather than an asset. Western defense experts in Military Watch magazine observed that every attack forces Moscow to divert disproportionate resources just to maintain symbolic control. The cost-benefit ratio has inverted. Billions are now spent defending territory that no longer yields strategic or political gain. Even Donald Trump's White House, while publicly calling for restraint, continues to greenlight expanded intelligence sharing with Kyiv, a subtle sign that Washington views Crimea's destabilization as a leverage point in future negotiations. Inside Russia, the once unshakable narrative of unity is crumbling. The Kremlin's propaganda machine, faced with mounting disillusionment, has shifted tone from triumphalism to fatalism. Television pundits now speak of a long war of attrition and necessary patience, terms that barely conceal exhaustion. Younger Russians, meanwhile, are tuning out entirely. Social researchers from the Levada Center report a 40% drop in youth engagement with state media and a spike in emigration interest. The generation that grew up watching Crimea's annexation on television now watches its disintegration on TikTok. The cycle of empire and decline is unfolding in real time. And yet, amid the silence, a question lingers, one that neither Moscow nor Kyiv can yet answer. What becomes of Crimea when fear replaces ideology? The peninsula's future may no longer hinge on military lines, but on human ones, the families leaving the soldiers, refusing the mothers mourning, and the young refusing to return. For Putin, the greatest threat is no longer NATO or Ukrainian drones. It is the erosion of belief inside his own borders. In the end, the Crimean dream that began as a spectacle of power is ending as a lesson in overreach. What was taken by force is now slipping away through collapse, fatigue, and disbelief. History rarely reverses itself neatly, but it always finds balance. Crimea, once a trophy of empire, now stands as its gravestone, a monument to how quickly a nation's pride can turn into its burden. The October 5 airstrikes on Crimea marked a decisive turning point in Russia's war. Ukraine's coordinated drone and missile operation, part of its evolving strategic strangulation doctrine, crippled the peninsula's fuel transport and command systems. The destruction of Feodosia's oil terminal triggered panic mass flight and a logistical chain reaction that Moscow could not contain. Socially, the chaos exposed Russia's deep class divide, poor minorities bearing the war's heaviest burden, while Moscow's elite remained insulated. Politically, the illusion of Kremlin control fractured as mothers' networks, local protests, and telegram leaks revealed widening cracks in authority. Demographically, Crimea's population decline accelerated Russia's broader crisis. Youth lost to war, professionals fleeing abroad, and industries facing collapse. By late 2025, Crimea had shifted from asset to liability, its defense draining resources and morale. For Putin, the peninsula once symbolized restored greatness. Now it stands as the embodiment of imperial decay. Ukraine may not yet hold Crimea, but it has already broken its myth, and with it, the empire's most dangerous illusion that fear could sustain forever what truth has already undone.